The shadow of Willow Heights. John Jackson, a 55-year-old janitor with a lean but sturdy frame, began his mornings long before the residents of Willow Heights stirred. With a battered lunchbox in one hand and a sense of quiet dignity in the other, he walked the narrow streets of the affluent neighborhood, his presence barely acknowledged by the towering mansions and pristine lawns. For over 2 decades, John had been the silent guardian of this utopia of wealth, his work keeping its beauty intact, though his efforts went unseen. The neighborhood of Willow Heights was more than just a display of wealth, it was a bastion of exclusivity. Tall gates guarded the mansions, manicured gardens sprawled over acres, and marble paths gleamed in the sunlight. To the residents, this was their paradise, a place where problems rarely seeped in and appearances were everything. To John, it was a reminder of the line drawn between those who lived here and those who served. On this particular morning, the sky was painted in shades of icy blue, and a crisp breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. John arrived at the communal garden, his favorite part of the neighborhood. The garden was a serene escape for the residents, but for John, it was a canvas where he painted order and cleanliness. Armed with his broom and clippers, he began his work, ensuring the marble paving glistened and the hedges stood neatly trimmed. As he swept the pathway, his concentration was broken by the sharp click of polished loafers on the stone. Looking up, he saw Mr. Whitmore, one of Willow Heights' most entitled residents. Dressed in a tailored blazer, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, Whitmore carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the world bent to his will. "Hey, you missed a spot," Whitmore barked, pointing to an imaginary smudge on the marble path. John paused, his hands gripping the broom. "Good morning, sir." "I'll get to it right away," he replied evenly, his voice calm but weary. Whitmore sneered, his lips curling as he leaned in. "People like you should be grateful to even be here," he said, his words dripping with condescension. "Just do your job." John felt the insult land like a punch to the gut, but years of enduring such remarks had taught him to remain composed. He nodded, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand as Whitmore turned and walked away. Around him, a few residents passed by, some shaking their heads subtly, others pretending not to notice. Not one of them intervened. A day of humiliation. As the day wore on, the sting of Whitmore's words lingered, but John buried his frustration in his work. He moved on to the park adjacent to the garden, raking leaves and cleaning the benches. Just as he finished his tasks, chaos erupted in the form of a golden retriever bounding into the park. The dog, its leash dragging behind it, tore through the freshly cleaned area, scattering leaves and smearing mud across the benches. Before John could take a breath, Whitmore appeared again, his face red with indignation. "What is this?" he bellowed, gesturing to the mess. "I leave for 10 minutes, and you can't even keep the park clean. What are we paying you for?" John opened his mouth to explain, to point out the paw prints clearly leading to the retreating dog, but Whitmore's glare silenced him. "Lazy," Whitmore muttered under his breath, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Humiliation burned through John as he returned to the park, his movements mechanical as he cleaned the mess. Each swipe of the broom felt heavier, weighed down by the anger and hurt he carried. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John finished his work and returned home, his heart heavy. A night of reflection. That evening, John sat at the kitchen table of his modest home, a small sanctuary filled with reminders of his family's love. His wife, Clara, served him a plate of steaming stew, her eyes soft with concern. "You seem quiet today," she said, sitting across from him. John hesitated before replying. "It's nothing new," he said, stirring his stew. "Whitmore had another go at me. Called me lazy, said I should be grateful to even be there." Clara reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You've worked harder than anyone in that place. They don't see it because they don't want to." John nodded, her words offering some comfort, but the question lingered in his mind, how much longer could he endure this? How much longer could he let himself be treated as invisible, or worse, unwelcome? A new low. The next morning, John returned to work, his shoulders heavy but his resolve intact. As he trimmed the hedges near the fountain, he overheard a group of residents chatting nearby. Their laughter floated through the air, light and carefree, until Whitmore's voice rose above the others. "John. He's lucky to be here," Whitmore said with a cruel laugh. "People like him don't aspire to anything." John's hands froze, the clippers still in his grasp. The words cut deeper than any insult hurled directly at him. Whitmore wasn't just dismissing his work, he was dismissing his worth, his dreams, his very humanity. Eric, a younger man who had recently moved into the neighborhood, hesitated before speaking. "That's not fair, Whitmore. He works hard." "Hardly," Whitmore scoffed. "He's been here for 20 years and hasn't moved an inch. That's not hard work, that's complacency." John's grip on the clippers tightened as he fought to steady his breathing. He had endured countless slights over the years, but this was different. This was a direct assault on his character, on the pride he took in his work. The storm approaches. As the week went on, John tried to push the incident out of his mind, focusing on his tasks. But the weight of Whitmore's words lingered, gnawing at his sense of self. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about his family, about the example he wanted to set for his children. On Friday, as John raked leaves in the communal garden, he noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The air grew thick and heavy, and a sharp wind cut through the neighborhood. The storm that had been forecasted all week was finally approaching. The residents of Willow Heights, accustomed to their comforts, barely paid attention to the warnings. As the first drops of rain began to fall, they retreated into their mansions, secure behind their gates and glass windows. But John, ever diligent, stayed behind to ensure the garden was secure. By nightfall, the storm had grown into a full-blown tempest. Trees swayed violently, their branches snapping under the force of the wind. Rain lashed against the windows, and the power flickered before plunging the neighborhood into darkness. John, soaked to the bone, sought shelter in the maintenance shed, his heart pounding as he watched the storm rage on. Little did he know, the night would soon demand more of him than he had ever given before. A cry for help. As John huddled in the shed, the sound of a faint scream pierced through the howling wind. He bolted upright, his instincts kicking in. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped into the storm, the rain blinding him as he scanned the area. The scream came again, louder this time. Following the sound, John found himself near Whitmore's mansion. The lights were out, and water was pooling dangerously close to the front door. In the distance, he saw a figure waving frantically, a young girl, her face pale with terror. It was Whitmore's daughter. "My dad. He's trapped in the basement," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm. "The water's rising." Without hesitation, John sprinted toward the house, his heart racing. The basement was already half flooded when he arrived, the water cold and relentless. Whitmore was slumped against the wall, struggling to stay conscious as the water climbed higher. "Hang on, sir," John shouted, wading through the water to reach him. He grabbed Whitmore under the arms, using every ounce of strength he had to pull him toward the stairs. The water fought back, but John refused to let go, his determination burning brighter than the storm. By the time John emerged from the house, Whitmore's daughter sobbing with relief, the storm was beginning to subside. Exhausted and drenched, John sat on the steps, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had saved the man who had humiliated him time and time again. But John didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it for gratitude. He did it because it was the right thing to do, because his character, his humanity, wasn't defined by the prejudices of others. Little did he know, this act of bravery would change everything. Storm clouds of prejudice. John Jackson arrived at work early the next morning, as he always did, long before the residents of Willow Heights stirred from their plush beds. The air was thick and heavy, a sign that the forecasted storm was drawing closer. John didn't mind, he welcomed the rhythm of raindrops on the roof, a soothing contrast to the tension he often carried home after a long day. But today, he couldn't shake the weight of Whitmore's words from the previous day, words that had cut deeper than he wanted to admit. As he swept the damp leaves off the marble paths, he overheard snippets of conversation drifting from the tennis courts. A group of residents stood gathered, their tennis gear slung casually over their shoulders. Among them was Whitmore, holding court as usual, his booming voice carrying across the courtyard. "Can you believe he's still here after all these years?" Whitmore said, his tone dripping with derision. "I mean, 20 years as a janitor. You'd think someone like him would have aimed higher by now." The others chuckled uncomfortably, clearly aware of the undertones in Whitmore's words but unwilling to challenge him. One of the women, a younger resident named Clara, frowned slightly and spoke up. "He does his job well, Mr. Whitmore. The place always looks spotless because of him." Whitmore scoffed. "Doing the bare minimum isn't exactly something to brag about, Clara. People like him don't have ambition, that's the problem. They're content to just exist." John paused mid-sweep, his grip tightening around the broom handle. He couldn't see their faces, but he didn't need to. He could hear the pity in Clara's voice and the disdain in Whitmore's. The words stung, not because they were new, but because they underscored the invisibility he had felt for so long. A quiet strength. John's role at Willow Heights wasn't just about maintaining the pristine grounds, it was about upholding his own sense of dignity. Each morning, as he donned his uniform and picked up his tools, he reminded himself of the values instilled in him by his parents: hard work, respect, and perseverance. These were the cornerstones of his life, the things that kept him grounded in the face of adversity. That morning, as he worked his way through the neighborhood, he noticed a familiar pattern. Residents walked past him without a second glance, their eyes sliding over him as though he were part of the scenery. Occasionally, someone would bark an order or point out an imagined flaw in his work, their words carrying the implicit assumption that he wasn't capable of noticing it himself. It wasn't always like this. When John first started at Willow Heights, he had been greeted with polite indifference rather than outright disdain. Over time, as the residents grew used to his presence, that indifference turned into a kind of dismissiveness, a belief that his role in their lives was so minor it barely warranted acknowledgement. But John had learned to rise above it, focusing on the pride he took in his work rather than the judgment of others. A collision of worlds. Later that day, John was cleaning the large communal fountain that served as the centerpiece of Willow Heights. The fountain, an ornate structure with marble sculptures and cascading water, was one of the most photographed spots in the neighborhood. It was also one of the most challenging areas to maintain, requiring constant attention to keep it looking immaculate. As John scrubbed the base of the fountain, he heard the unmistakable sound of a luxury car pulling up nearby. Turning his head, he saw Eric, a relatively new resident, stepping out of his sleek black SUV. Eric was younger than most of the residents, a tech entrepreneur who had made his fortune in app development. Unlike many of his neighbors, Eric was approachable and had even exchanged a few friendly words with John in the past. "Morning, John," Eric called out, offering a casual wave. "Morning, Mr. Eric," John replied, nodding politely. Eric walked over, his gaze sweeping across the fountain. "Looks great, as always. You've got a real talent for this." John smiled faintly. "Just doing my job, sir." Before Eric could respond, Whitmore appeared, striding toward them with his usual air of superiority. "Ah, Eric, there you are," Whitmore said, barely glancing at John. "I was just telling some of the others about the gala next weekend. You're coming, I assume?" Eric nodded. "Wouldn't miss it. Looks like it'll be a great event." Whitmore's eyes flicked toward John, his expression tightening. "Let's hope the place looks as good as it does now," he said pointedly. "We can't have our guests thinking we don't take care of our grounds." Eric frowned slightly but said nothing, sensing the tension. Whitmore, satisfied that his point had been made, turned and walked away, leaving Eric and John standing in silence. "Ignore him," Eric said after a moment. "He thinks his money gives him the right to talk down to people, but it doesn't." John nodded, appreciating the sentiment but knowing it wouldn't change anything. "It's just part of the job," he said simply. The storm begins. As the day wore on, the skies grew darker, and the wind began to pick up. John worked quickly to secure the garden furniture and ensure that the drains were clear, preparing for the storm that was forecasted to hit that evening. Despite his efficiency, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. By the time the storm rolled in, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. Most of the residents had retreated into their mansions, safe behind their gates and security systems. John, however, remained on duty, his small maintenance shed serving as his refuge from the torrential rain. Around midnight, as the storm raged outside, John received a frantic call from the neighborhood security office. "John, we've got a problem," the guard said, his voice tight with panic. "A tree's come down on Whitmore's property. Looks like it took out part of the roof." John's stomach sank. "Is everyone okay?" "Not sure," the guard admitted. Whitmore's wife and daughter were out of town, but he was home. "We can't get through to him." Without hesitation, John grabbed his flashlight and raincoat, bracing himself against the wind as he made his way to Whitmore's mansion. The streets were littered with debris, and the rain stung his face like needles, but he pressed on, his determination outweighing his exhaustion. When he arrived at the mansion, the damage was worse than he'd imagined. A massive oak tree had crashed through the roof, its branches jutting out like jagged spears. Water poured into the house through the gaping hole, and the sound of the storm was deafening. "Mr. Whitmore!" John shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. From inside, he heard a faint reply, followed by a series of coughs. John pushed open the door, stepping into the chaos. Furniture was overturned, and the floor was slick with water. He found Whitmore slumped in a corner, his leg pinned under a fallen beam. "Hold on, sir," John said, rushing to his side. "I'm going to get you out of here." A moment of humanity. John assessed the situation quickly. The beam was heavy, but with enough leverage, he could move it. Grabbing a nearby piece of wood, he wedged it under the beam and pushed with all his strength. His muscles burned, and the strain was immense, but slowly, the beam began to shift. Why are you doing this?" Whitmore rasped, his face pale with pain. John paused, meeting his eyes. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. With one final push, the beam came free. John helped Whitmore to his feet, supporting him as they made their way out of the house. The storm raged on, but John's focus never wavered. By the time they reached safety, both men were soaked and exhausted, but alive. For the first time, Whitmore looked at John not with disdain, but with something resembling respect. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice tinged with gratitude. John nodded, his expression unreadable. "Just doing my job, sir." The morning after. When the storm finally subsided, Willow Heights was left to grapple with the aftermath. The once pristine neighborhood was now littered with fallen trees, broken windows, and flooded lawns. But amid the devastation, something unexpected began to emerge, a sense of unity. The residents, many of whom had previously ignored John, now approached him with genuine appreciation. They had heard about his actions during the storm, about how he had risked his life to save one of their own. For the first time, they saw him not as just the janitor, but as a man of character and courage. As John walked through the neighborhood, assessing the damage, he felt a shift in the way people looked at him. The invisible man was invisible no longer. And while the scars of prejudice couldn't be erased overnight, John knew that change, however small, had begun. The storm had taken much from Willow Heights, but it had also given something back, a chance to rebuild, not just their homes, but their humanity. And in the center of it all was John, a man who had shown them the power of quiet strength and unwavering dignity. The weight of the storm. The storm that had swept through Willow Heights left devastation in its wake. By dawn, the once perfect neighborhood was a scene of chaos. Fallen trees blocked roads, roofs had been torn apart, and the manicured lawns now resembled murky ponds. For the residents, it was a rude awakening. For John Jackson, it was another day of work, albeit one filled with challenges far greater than usual. A community in crisis. John arrived early, as always, his tools slung over his shoulder and a determination etched into his weathered face. The maintenance shed, which had served as his refuge during the storm, was still standing, though the nearby garden it overlooked was in shambles. As he surveyed the damage, his heart sank. Willow Heights, with all its opulence, now resembled a war zone. Residents began emerging from their homes, wrapped in robes and jackets, their expressions a mix of disbelief and irritation. For many of them, this was the first time they'd faced real inconvenience in years. Accustomed to comfort and control, they now found themselves grappling with nature's indifference. Whitmore's voice was the first to break the quiet. "Where's the janitor?" he barked, standing on the front steps of his mansion, which now had a gaping hole in its roof. His pristine white slippers were soaked in rainwater, his face red with frustration. John approached, his boots squelching in the mud. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," he said, his tone calm despite the chaos. "I've already started clearing the main pathways. I'll be working my way toward the houses shortly." "Work faster," Whitmore snapped. "This place looks like a disaster zone. People like you should be prepared for this sort of thing." John bit back a reply, nodding instead. He had learned long ago that arguing with people like Whitmore was a losing battle. Instead, he turned his focus to the tasks at hand, clearing debris, unblocking drains, and restoring some semblance of order to the neighborhood. An unlikely partnership. As John worked, he noticed Eric, the young tech entrepreneur, stepping out of his SUV with a pair of gloves and a rake. Unlike many of the other residents, Eric didn't seem content to wait for someone else to fix the mess. He walked over to John, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. "Need a hand?" Eric asked, offering a small smile. John was taken aback. In all his years at Willow Heights, no resident had ever offered to help. "I appreciate it, but you don't have to," John said. "I know," Eric replied. "But this isn't just your mess to clean up. We all live here." For a moment, John hesitated. Then, with a nod, he handed Eric a spare rake. The two men worked side by side, clearing branches and leaves from the communal garden. Their teamwork drew curious glances from other residents, some of whom looked away, embarrassed, while others simply watched in silence. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Eric asked as they worked. 20 years, John replied. "Long enough to know this place inside and out. And long enough to put up with people like Whitmore," Eric said, his tone light but pointed. John chuckled softly. "He's not the first, and he won't be the last." The turning point. As the morning wore on, John and Eric made significant progress in the garden. The pathways were once again navigable, and the fountain, though still clogged with debris, was starting to resemble its former glory. But their work was interrupted by a panicked voice. "Help! Someone help!" The voice belonged to Mrs. Carter, one of the older residents. She was standing near her front porch, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the street. John and Eric rushed over to find the source of her distress. A toppled tree had fallen onto her car, trapping her small dog inside. The terrified animal's yelps were barely audible over the sound of the wind still lingering from the storm. "Don't worry, ma'am," John said, his voice steady. "We'll get him out." Eric grabbed a crowbar from his SUV while John assessed the situation. The tree was heavy, but it wasn't impossible to move. With Eric's help, John managed to lift the trunk just enough for Mrs. Carter to reach in and pull her dog to safety. "Oh, thank you," Mrs. Carter cried, clutching the shivering animal to her chest. I don't know what I would have done without you." "It's all right, ma'am," John said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Just glad we could help." The shift in perception. Word of John's actions spread quickly through Willow Heights. Residents who had once dismissed him as an invisible presence now began to see him in a new light. He wasn't just the janitor, he was a man who had risked his own safety to help others during a crisis. Slowly but surely, the wall of indifference that had surrounded him for years began to crack. Even Whitmore, though reluctant to admit it, seemed to soften. Later that afternoon, as John was clearing debris near Whitmore's property, the man approached him. "Jackson," Whitmore said, his tone gruff. "About earlier, you saved my life. I owe you for that." John looked up, surprised by the admission. "Just doing my job, sir," he replied. "No," Whitmore said, shaking his head. "What you did, risking yourself like that, it wasn't just your job. It was more than that." For the first time, John saw a flicker of humility in Whitmore's eyes. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to give John hope that change, however incremental, was possible. Rebuilding together. As the day turned to evening, the residents of Willow Heights began to emerge from their homes, many of them inspired by John's actions. Families worked together to clear debris from their driveways, neighbors shared tools and supplies, and a sense of community that had long been absent began to take root. John, exhausted but content, watched from a distance as the neighborhood came alive with activity. For years, he had been the invisible force that kept Willow Heights running, the man behind the scenes who ensured everything was perfect. Now, for the first time, he felt truly seen. Eric approached him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing one to John. "Thanks," John said, taking a grateful sip. "You know," Eric said, glancing around at the bustling neighborhood, "I think this storm might have been the best thing to happen to this place. It's forced people to look beyond themselves for once." John nodded, his gaze distant. "Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." A new dawn. By the time the sun set, Willow Heights was far from perfect, but it was on its way to recovery. And as John packed up his tools and headed home, he carried with him a sense of quiet pride, not just in his work, but in the small but significant shift he had witnessed. The storm had revealed the cracks in the neighborhood, both physical and emotional. But it had also revealed something far more powerful, the resilience of a community, and the capacity for people to change when given the chance. For John, the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the people of Willow Heights. And as he walked down the darkened street, the stars beginning to pierce through the clouds, he allowed himself a rare smile. This, he thought, was just the beginning. The aftermath of change. The morning after the storm, Willow Heights was bathed in an eerie stillness. The chaos of the night before had given way to a quiet that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Fallen branches, shattered glass, and muddy pools were scattered across the once pristine neighborhood. But amidst the wreckage, a sense of tentative hope was beginning to bloom, a fragile, new energy sparked by John Jackson's tireless efforts during the storm. John arrived early, as usual, though his body ached from the previous day's labor. His weathered boots squelched against the damp ground as he took in the scene before him. It was still a mess, but progress had been made. The residents had started to pitch in, working together to clean up what the storm had left behind. For John, it was a rare sight to see these people, so often preoccupied with their own lives, coming together for a common purpose. As he began his day, John couldn't help but notice the curious glances and hesitant nods of acknowledgement from the residents. These were the same people who had once ignored him or treated him with indifference. Now, they seemed to see him in a new light. An unexpected invitation. By mid-morning, John was clearing debris near the communal fountain when he was approached by Clara, one of the younger residents. Clara was known for her quiet kindness, though she often hesitated to speak out against the louder voices in the neighborhood. Mr. Jackson, she began, her voice soft but earnest, I just wanted to thank you for everything you did during the storm. You've gone above and beyond for this community, and, well, we've been talking. John raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. Talking? Yes, she said, fidgeting slightly. A few of us thought it would be a good idea to hold a small gathering. Something to show our appreciation for everything you've done, not just during the storm, but over the years. John was taken aback. In all his time at Willow Heights, he had never been invited to anything beyond a curt nod or a brief thank you. That's very kind of you, but there's no need for that, he said, shaking his head. I was just doing my job. Clara smiled, her eyes warm. You've done more than your job, Mr. Jackson. Please, think about it. As she walked away, John found himself conflicted. Part of him wanted to decline, to keep his head down and continue his work as he always had. But another part of him, the part that had grown weary of being invisible, felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, the desire to be seen. Whitmore's change of heart. Meanwhile, in the largest mansion on the block, Mr. Whitmore sat in his study, staring out at the storm-ravaged lawn. His leg, still bandaged from the night before, throbbed faintly as a reminder of his narrow escape. He couldn't shake the memory of John pulling him from the wreckage, the sheer determination in the man's eyes as he risked his own safety to save him. Whitmore wasn't used to being in anyone's debt, let alone someone he had so often dismissed. The realization gnawed at him, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth of his behavior. For years, he had treated John as an invisible presence, someone who existed to serve but was otherwise unworthy of acknowledgement. Now, he couldn't ignore the man's quiet courage and unwavering sense of duty. As the day wore on, Whitmore found himself pacing his study, wrestling with his thoughts. Finally, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used. Clara, he said when she answered. About this gathering you're planning, I'd like to contribute. The gathering. By evening, the residents of Willow Heights had gathered in the communal garden, which had been hastily cleaned and decorated for the occasion. String lights hung between the trees, casting a warm glow over the crowd. Tables were set up with food and drinks, and the hum of conversation filled the air. John arrived late, still unsure about whether he belonged at such an event. He had spent the day working, as usual, and his clothes bore the marks of his labor, mud-streaked pants, scuffed boots, and a shirt damp with sweat. As he approached the gathering, he hesitated at the edge of the crowd, feeling out of place among the well-dressed residents. But then he saw Eric, who waved him over with a grin. There you are, Eric said, clapping him on the shoulder. We've been waiting for you. John allowed himself to be led into the crowd, where he was met with a surprising sight. The residents, many of whom had never acknowledged him before, were smiling and offering their thanks. Even Whitmore, standing with a cane near one of the tables, gave him a nod of respect. Mr. Jackson, Whitmore said as John approached. I owe you an apology, and my life. I haven't always treated you with the respect you deserve, and for that, I'm sorry. John was stunned into silence for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but kind. Thank you, sir. It means a lot to hear that. Whitmore extended a hand, and after a brief hesitation, John shook it. Stories shared and lessons learned. As the evening went on, John found himself at the center of the gathering, something he had never experienced before. Residents shared stories of how he had gone out of his way to help them over the years, fixing a broken fence, retrieving a lost dog, or staying late to ensure the neighborhood was spotless for an event. For the first time, John realized just how much his quiet acts of kindness had impacted the community. Clara stood to give a brief speech, her voice filled with emotion. Mr. Jackson, you've taught us something we all needed to learn, that true strength doesn't come from wealth or status, but from character and compassion. We're grateful for everything you've done, and we're sorry it took us so long to see it. The crowd erupted into applause, and John, though deeply moved, felt a wave of humility wash over him. "I appreciate your kind words," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I didn't do any of this for recognition. I did it because it's the right thing to do. And because, well, this place matters to me. You all matter to me. A new beginning." By the end of the night, as the crowd began to disperse and the string lights swayed gently in the breeze, John felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. The residents, who had once viewed him as little more than a shadow, now saw him for who he truly was, a man of quiet strength and unwavering integrity. As he walked home, his steps felt lighter than they had in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, John felt that he wasn't walking it alone. The storm had changed Willow Heights, and it had changed him, too. And as the stars emerged from behind the clouds, John allowed himself a rare smile, knowing that this was not an ending, but a new beginning. Breaking down the walls. The aftermath of the gathering lingered like a faint hum across Willow Heights. Residents exchanged knowing nods in the mornings, shared polite words over fences, and even offered quiet smiles in John Jackson's direction. The invisible man had become visible. Yet, while the evening had been a significant step forward, the deeper transformation of attitudes was far from complete. For some, the cracks in prejudice were widening; for others, the old walls still stood firm. John, as always, approached each day with quiet determination. The garden he loved so dearly had suffered significant damage during the storm, and its restoration was now his primary focus. Kneeling in the dirt, he tended to the shattered hedges and uprooted plants. His hands moved deftly, guided by years of practice and a deep respect for the beauty of nature. To him, this was more than work; it was a form of healing, a way to bring life back to a broken place. The weight of the past. As John worked, he couldn't help but reflect on the changes he'd seen in the past weeks. The residents of Willow Heights, who had once regarded him with indifference or disdain, now greeted him with gratitude and respect. Whitmore, in particular, had softened dramatically, often stopping to chat or offer assistance. Yet, despite these shifts, John couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension that still lingered. Not everyone had embraced the change. Among the residents, there were whispers of discomfort, quiet murmurs about how things were different now. While some celebrated the newfound sense of community, others clung to their old ways, their prejudices hidden behind polite smiles. John felt the weight of it all, the progress made and the obstacles that remained. He had spent decades enduring the subtle slights and overt dismissals, and while he was grateful for the recent recognition, he knew that true change took time. Day before. John's heart sank. It wasn't just the mess, it was the realization that someone had deliberately undone his work. He knelt by the fountain, running his fingers over the muddy surface, his mind racing. Was this an accident, or was it a message? As he began to clean, a voice interrupted him. "Looks like someone's been making trouble." John turned to see Eric standing nearby, his brow furrowed with concern. "I noticed it on my morning run," Eric continued. "Thought I'd come by to see if you needed help." John nodded, grateful for the offer but hesitant to accept. "I can handle it," he said. "It's not the first time something like this has happened." Eric crouched beside him, picking up a stray branch. "It shouldn't happen at all. After everything you've done, you deserve better." John sighed, his hands still scrubbing at the marble. "Change doesn't come easy, Eric. Some people see it as a threat." Eric's jaw tightened. "Then we need to show them that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." The confrontation. Later that day, Eric called an impromptu meeting in the communal garden. The residents gathered reluctantly, their curiosity piqued by his urgency. John stood off to the side, his hands clasped behind his back, watching as Eric addressed the crowd. "Good morning, everyone," Eric began, his voice firm. "I wanted to bring something to your attention. This morning, I found the fountain vandalized and the garden in disarray. It's clear that someone deliberately sabotaged the work John has been doing to restore this place." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces registering shock while others looked away uncomfortably. "This isn't just about the garden," Eric continued. "It's about respect. John has dedicated his life to making this neighborhood a better place, and he deserves more than this. We all do." Whitmore stepped forward, his cane tapping against the ground. "Eric's right," he said, his voice steady. "We've all benefited from John's work, and it's time we start taking responsibility for our actions, and for each other." The tension in the crowd was palpable. Some residents nodded in agreement, while others remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Clara spoke up. "If we want to call this a community, we need to act like one. That means supporting each other and standing up against behavior like this." A glimmer of hope. In the days that followed, a subtle but significant shift began to take place. The residents of Willow Heights, spurred by Eric's call to action, started taking a more active role in the upkeep of their neighborhood. They volunteered to help John with the garden, offered to assist with repairs, and even organized a neighborhood watch to prevent further incidents. For John, the support was both humbling and heartening. He had spent so many years working in the shadows, unnoticed and unappreciated, that the sudden attention felt almost overwhelming. But as he watched the residents come together, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in his work, but in the community they were building. Even Whitmore, who had once been his harshest critic, had become one of his most vocal supporters. One afternoon, as they worked side by side to replant a hedge, Whitmore turned to him and said, "You know, Jackson, I used to think people like you didn't matter. But I was wrong. You've shown me what it means to truly care about something." John met his gaze, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We all matter, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes it just takes a storm to remind us." A quiet triumph. As the weeks passed, the garden began to bloom once more. The fountain sparkled in the sunlight, the hedges stood tall and neat, and the pathways were free of debris. But the true transformation wasn't in the landscape, it was in the people. The residents of Willow Heights, who had once been divided by their own privilege and prejudice, had begun to see each other, and John, in a new light. They had learned to look beyond appearances, to value character over status, and to recognize the strength in quiet perseverance. For John, the journey was far from over. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as he stood in the garden, surrounded by the people he had come to know as more than just residents, he felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. The walls that had once separated them were crumbling, brick by brick. And in their place, something stronger was beginning to grow, a true community, rooted in respect and compassion. And for the first time in a long time, John Jackson felt like he belonged. A garden reborn. The golden rays of the morning sun spilled across Willow Heights, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns and stately mansions. The storm's destruction, once an oppressive reminder of nature's wrath, had been all but erased. The fountain sparkled as water cascaded down its marble tiers, the pathways were pristine, and the garden was alive with color once more. For John Jackson, this was not just a physical transformation but a deeply personal one. It was the culmination of years of quiet endurance and an unexpected validation of his worth. A day of celebration. The residents of Willow Heights had planned a special event to honor the restoration of the garden and, more importantly, to celebrate John's contributions. The idea had come from Clara and Eric, but nearly everyone had pitched in to make it happen. Tables adorned with fresh flowers and linen cloths lined the garden's main pathway. A buffet of carefully prepared dishes sat under a canopy, while string lights hung between the trees, waiting to illuminate the evening. John, ever the humble worker, arrived at the garden early that morning to ensure everything was in place. But when he saw Clara standing by the entrance with a knowing smile, he realized this time was different. "Mr. Jackson," Clara said warmly, her hands clasped together, "you've done enough. Today is about you. Let us take care of the rest." John hesitated, his hand still holding the broom he had instinctively brought with him. "I appreciate it, ma'am, but I'm not used to, well, this kind of attention." "You've more than earned it," Clara said, her voice firm but kind. "Please, let us do this for you." Reluctantly, John set the broom aside and allowed himself to be led to a chair near the fountain. As he sat, he couldn't help but feel a wave of unease. For years, he had worked in the background, content to be unnoticed. Now, all eyes would be on him. The ceremony. As the day turned to evening, the residents began to gather in the garden, their voices filling the air with laughter and conversation. For the first time, John saw them not as distant figures in a world apart from his own, but as people who had come to appreciate him not just for his work, but for the person he was. Whitmore, dressed in a tailored suit but noticeably lacking his usual air of superiority, stepped forward to address the crowd. A microphone in hand, he cleared his throat, his gaze settling on John. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore began, his voice steady but tinged with humility, "we've all had our lives made easier by the work of one man, a man who, for far too long, we failed to truly see. John Jackson has been the backbone of Willow Heights, and during the storm, he proved himself to be far more than a janitor. He is a hero." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd as Whitmore continued. "I owe him my life, and I owe him an apology. For years, I looked down on him, believing that his work was beneath notice. But I was wrong. John has shown us all what it means to care for something deeply, to give without expecting anything in return." Whitmore turned to face John directly. "On behalf of all of us, thank you." The crowd erupted into applause, and John, though deeply moved, felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He rose to his feet, his hands raised slightly to quiet the applause. "I don't know what to say," John began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I've spent my life doing what I thought was right, taking pride in my work, treating people with respect, and trying to make this place a little better every day. I never expected recognition for it. But seeing all of you come together, seeing the way this community has changed, that means more to me than I can put into words. A gesture of gratitude." As the evening wore on, Eric stepped forward with a surprise announcement. "We wanted to do something special to show our gratitude," he said, motioning for John to join him near the fountain. "So, we all chipped in to give you this." Eric handed John an envelope. Inside was a certificate for a week-long vacation at a seaside resort, complete with airfare and accommodations for two. John's eyes widened as he looked at the certificate, his hands trembling slightly. I don't know what to say," John stammered. "This is too much." "It's not enough," Clara said, stepping forward. "You've given so much to this community, John. It's time we gave something back." For a moment, John was overcome with emotion. He had never been on a real vacation, never allowed himself the luxury of rest. The idea of spending a week by the ocean, away from the demands of work, felt almost surreal. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice thick with gratitude. "I'll never forget this." The seeds of change. As the celebration continued, John found himself at the center of a series of heartfelt conversations. Residents approached him one by one, sharing stories of how his quiet acts of kindness had touched their lives. A woman thanked him for finding her lost dog years ago. A young couple credited him with fixing a broken swing in the park where they had first met. Even Whitmore, in a rare moment of vulnerability, admitted that John's courage during the storm had inspired him to be a better person. For John, these moments were more meaningful than any gift. They were a testament to the power of small, consistent acts of goodness, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, integrity could make a difference. A new legacy. By the end of the night, as the string lights cast a warm glow over the garden, John stood by the fountain, watching as the residents laughed and talked like old friends. It was a scene he had never imagined in his years at Willow Heights, a true community, brought together not by wealth or status, but by shared respect and gratitude. As he looked around, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The garden, once a symbol of his invisibility, had become a place where he was seen, valued, and celebrated. And while the road to change was still long, he knew that they had taken an important first step. The night ended with a toast, led by Clara. To John Jackson, she said, raising her glass. A man who reminds us all of the power of kindness, resilience, and quiet strength. The crowd echoed her words, their voices filling the air with warmth and admiration. And as John raised his own glass, a rare smile spread across his face. For the first time in decades, he felt truly at home.